Hello, this is Botany and Plant Sciences um, course 031, Spring Wildflowers. This is our last formal asynchronous lecture of a quarter, corresponding to Monday, June the 1st, year 2020. It's our 10th week of classes, and this is lecture one and the only lecture for this week. So it's week 10, lecture one. The other 2 days of this week, we're going to do a review of the course and prepare for the final exam. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about a group that we know normally in common jargon as ferns, and also a broader group known as fern allies, which are plants that have some traits shared with ferns and are taxonomically related to ferns. In botany, all that group is known as Pteridophytes with a P, P-T-E, Pteridophytes, which means the winged plants because of the nature of its folios, leaves, and the lack of seeds. I'm going to talk about that in more detail today. So let me move to the slideshow for this week. And what are the traits? What makes you identify a fern? I assume that most of you, when you're in the field or in a garden and you see a fern, you immediately identify it as such. And one is the megaphylls, the large leaves or leaf-like structures that seem to come off from the ground or come off from the ground. The lack of a visible stem. Not all ferns, because there are some tree-like ferns, but normally the garden ferns that you see and the ferns that you see in California, in forests or in other ecosystems in California, they only have megaphylls, large leaves, and they don't have any true stem. So what you see are complex leaves coming out of the ground. They don't have seeds or flowers or cones or any type of visible reproductive structures other than some little dots on the underside of the leaf where the spores are produced. And so the presence of spores and the spore-bearing structure called sporangia is what defines really ferns more than anything else. So the large complex leaves, the ability to reproduce by spores, and the presence of sporangia that are located on the underside of the leaves and look like little dots. They dot the underside of the leaf. The stem, when present, is basically an underground rhizome. It doesn't have an aerial stem. The stem is an underground rhizome. The roots come off the rhizome and the leaves come off the stem. Normally, botanists are unwilling to call the leaves in the case of ferns. They prefer to call them fronds because, as you will see, they have a really complex structure. And as opposed to the leaves of flowering plants of angiosperms and gymnosperms, where you can identify the leaf by its insertion in a node and the presence of a node with an axillary bud. Here, none of this happens, so the leaves have a very particular structure, but basically there are large photosynthetic structures called fronds. You have a photo, let me start with this one, of the oak fern, Gymnocarpium Dryopteris. And if you look, let me move the mouse here, you see the large frond has here one branch of the frond that is divided pinnately. So it has like pinnae, like leaflets that divide the frond into subsegments or subfronts. Now, if you look at each subsegment, they will look again like the bigger front. It's like a smaller front that comes, and it's divided again into subsegments. This ability to repeat the branching pattern of a photosynthetic structure over and over again has drawn the attention of a lot of people, including mathematicians and now in modern times computer scientists. For example, Barnsley, an English mathematician, created this structure that made him famous a few years ago, more than a few years, a couple of decades ago, when he programmed a computer to basically draw a little frond-like structure and then repeat the same frond and structure it again and again and again at smaller and smaller scales. You can zoom in and you will see that the structure repeats itself over and over again. This is what in mathematics we call a fractal. And what he showed is basically, for us, for botanists, the fractal nature of fern leaves, how the dividing motive of the cells is repeated at lower and lower scales along the leaf. It seems to be a compound leaf divided itself into second order compound leaves, divided itself into third order compound leaves, dividing itself into fourth order compound leaves, and so on and so forth. I won't go in this talk onto the complex mathematics of fractals, but basically the reason why I show this is because sometimes it's counterintuitive. When you see this image, it obviously looks like a fern, but it's really not a fern. It's a mathematical equation of a fractal model that repeats in an iteration manner the same morphological pattern that makes the drawing of the equation at one scale into lower and lower scales. Ferns have a fascinating life cycle, and it's completely different to that of seed plants, and it's really worthwhile to see it in some detail. Here you have the typical adult fern with a rhizome, which is the stem, the fronds coming out of the rhizome, the big fronds, which are the leafy structures coming out. And in the underside of the leaves, you have sori, which are these dots with spores. And the sori are just a bunch, in each sorus, a bunch of sporangia, which are microscopic little boxes where the spores are. When the sporangia are ripe, they open and they release the spores. The spores, in more than one way, are pretty much like the semen in animals, or like pollen in higher plants. They are haploid. They have half the number of chromosomes of a mother plant. So they go through divisive meiosis, reduction meiosis. They divide the number of chromosomes into half, and the spores are basically gametes that contain only half of a number of chromosomes. Now, here comes the fact that makes spores so different in the reproduction to plants and also to animals, at least to the animals we know, like mammals. The spore falls to the ground and germinates like a seed. And it germinates into a little photosynthetic structure that looks a little bit like a moss or like a liverwort. It looks like a very primitive type of life form, even like the beginning growth of an algae. It has some rhizoids, which are these hair-like structures that attach it to the ground where it gets its nutrients. And in this green structure that is known as a gametophyte, what you have is male and female structures. The female structure is known as the archegonium. It's a little cell that has an embryo, an egg, an ovule, And the antheridium, which are here in the back, are little structures that release sperm. In this case, it is sperm, sensu stricto. I always tell you in class that pollen is like the sperm of plants. In this case, it is sperm because it has a cilia, like a little tail, that allows it to wiggle in water and move along. When it rains and the gametophyte is wet, the sperm will move from the antheridium into the archegonium and fertilize the egg. If there are more than one gametophyte growing together, the sperm might even move from one gametophyte to another and fertilize the egg of another gametophyte. So they might self-fertilize or cross-fertilize into another gametophyte. The egg then, when it's fertilized, it receives one complete set of chromosomes from the sperm, and so it becomes diploid. It starts growing like a zygote, like an ovule, and it starts growing until from the gametophyte a new plant starts growing, that is a new fern. So the fern has two different types of plants, which is what makes it so different to other plants. Its life cycle involves the life cycle of the larger plant, what we know as a sporophyte, that ends when it releases the spores. But then the spores fall to the ground, they germinate, and they produce a completely different type of plant. It's almost bizarre to think about it. Imagine that our sperm or our ovules, I'm talking about animal sperm or animal ovules, could walk out of a host of an animal that bears them and walk around like a different thing and be alive and independent for a little while. Like our sperm would be little organisms that can walk around and live with us in the same environment. This was so complex that for a while botanists believed that these little structures, the gametophytes, were really another species. They thought it was a moss or a liverwort, a smaller type of photosynthetic plant, until they studied in detail and they realized that ferns have a double cycle of life. They spend part of their life in the form of a gametophyte, and then a larger and significant part of their life in the form of a sporophyte. You can see here the sori containing the spores on the underside of a fern, or a polypodium fern. Another interesting thing about ferns, they are the first plants that appeared on Earth after mosses that had conductive tissue. They're vascular plants. If you cut a leaf, the petiole of a frond, the supporting stem of a frond, you will see that it has conductive bundles of cells that actually can move water from the roots in the ground to the leaves. Mosses, which appeared on Earth before ferns, cannot do this. So the ferns are the first vascular plants on Earth, and one of the traits is the presence of conductive tissue. Anyway, here we have exactly the same diagram I was showing. This is one I drew myself, where we will repeat again in more detail. You have this in your lecture notes. The adult sporophyte, the fern itself, has sora in the leaves that contain sporangia. The sporangia will eventually ripen and open, release spores. The spores will germinate and produce a gametophyte, also known as a prothallus. The gametophyte is the other type of life, the haploid generation of the fern. And it can live for many years in the haploid phase. It's an independent plant. It has little rhizomes, little roots, and they normally live in shady places in forests. And they can live there for a while until they produce an archegonium with an ovule, and it gets fertilized by the sperm in the antheridium, and it produces a zygote that will germinate and produce a new fern, a new sporophyte. This is known as alternation of generations, and it's very, very typical in ferns. And of course, there is some evolutionary memory of alternation of generations in gymnosperms and in angiosperms in the way they produce a zygote, but it's a technicality, really. For all practical purposes, higher plants, flowering plants, are haploid. They produce, are diploid, like we are. They produce pollen and ovules. The ovules stay in the mother plant. The pollen flies in the air, is taken by an insect until it fertilizes the ovule, and then you have again a diploid individual. So the haploid phase, the phase with half of the chromosomes, is actually not able to survive on its own. It's like animal sperm. Animal sperm cannot walk around and live in the world like the diploid individuals can. It can do. It just lives for a very, very short time. Okay. Some interesting ferns here, and I don't expect you to remember them at all, but just to see some illustrations of the leaves and their types. All these are ferns that live in California, especially in the high Sierras. Cystopteris fragilis. It has, you can see here, the protalus or the gametophyte, the little structure of alternation of generations, and a germinating new plant. The plant itself, you can see it here with the spores in the underside of the leaves, and the sporangia in the underside of the leaves, and the dots called sori. And you can see also the way the bud in ferns germinate, the way the bud in ferns germinate, they open from one side. And so pretty much remember when we saw in our class the Boraginaceae that produce cymes that look like a scorpion tail, and we call them scorpioid cymes. Ferns have scorpioid buds. The buds themselves are disentangling, grow from a spirally arranged set of stem cells. Gymnocarpium dryopteris, same thing. You can see the rhizome, the underground rhizome, the fronds coming out, and the sori. Bracken. Bracken is an amazing fern. It's really the most widespread plant in the world, as a matter of fact. Bracken forms dense formations in Scotland, also in Scandinavia, and in Iceland. It really likes or tolerates well the northern temperatures. It's also present in high mountains in the United States. You will find it in wet high mountains here in our Sierras, all over the place. But you will also find it in Australia, the wet mountains of Tasmania. You will find it in New Zealand. You will find it in Patagonia. You will find it, believe it or not, in Venezuela, in the tropics, also in mountain areas where it's cool enough in the altitude. It's an amazing fern. It's all over the world. And the reason why it's so widespread is because of the abilities of spores to travel incredibly long distances. And that is an interesting reflection with respect to evolution. Evolution is not always necessarily, quote unquote, wise. When plants started becoming selected for seeds to produce seeds, they actually were able to produce embryos with endosperm, with a maternal endowment that gives them a better chance of survival. But they sacrifice something in exchange for the production of seeds, which is the ability to disperse. Spores can be dispersed in the air for thousands and thousands of miles. As a matter of fact, there have been samples of airs taken from the stratosphere by high-flying craft, and they find spores of ferns in general, and in particular bracken, all over the world. There's like the equatorial belt of winds moving around the earth is loaded with spores of bracken. They have an amazing dispersal ability. Dryopteris Felis max, um, um, not much else to see. You can see here the gametophyte, the prothallus. Here the gametophyte alone, here a gametophyte germinating. You can see one of the leaflets producing sori, and of course a leaf-like structure in the front with the fertile leaflets producing sori. Again, another last photograph of ferns with sori releasing spores into the air. Ferns in the world are all over the world. There's this fern that is very common in the Caribbean. If you've ever been to any country in the Caribbean, you will see it. It's either epiphyte or also grows at ground level. The leaves can vary in ferns in a number of ways. Sometimes they're difficult to tell as ferns, but again, like ferns, like gymnosperms, they never ever will show reticulate venation in the leaves. Remember, reticulate venation is a trait of the dicotyledons. And also you will often see, and will help you identify them as ferns, the fact that they have the scorpioid growth of the primordial cells and the sori under the leaves. Ferns were on Earth around for quite a long time, as a matter of fact. Well, they still are, but they were dominant plants on Earth for hundreds of millions of years before the gymnosperms became dominant. So somewhere between 300 and 200 million years before present, ferns were really the dominant type of life on Earth. And they could compete for light. Many ferns develop the ability to form above ground stems that can grow and try to outcompete other ferns for light. They're known as the tree ferns, still very common in tropical rainforests. You can see here a formation of tree ferns in a tropical rainforest. All these are just examples of different ferns. Just wanted to appreciate the incredible diversity of frond shapes and of sporangia. Sometimes the sporangia are on the edge, sometimes in the center, sometimes organized along long lines, sometimes in sori. Okay, that is all you need to know about ferns. Now we're almost done. We're going to talk about a yet even larger group known as the fern allies, which are basically plants that are not sensu-stricto ferns, but are reproduced by spores. Like ferns, they have sporangia, but they don't have the big fronds that characterize the ferns, but other type of morphologies. And this includes the whisk ferns, psilotems, that have the sporangia in little balls. You probably have seen them around in wet forests. The killworts, which are very rare, and because they look so much like a little grass, they're difficult to identify well in wet environments and water environments in mountains. Lycopodium, the club mosses, these are very, very common. I'm pretty sure you've seen them. And some people call them ground pines because their leaves, instead of forming big fronds like in the ferns, they look a little bit like the needle-like leaves of pines. So some people call them ground pines or club mosses. But if you look at the leaves themselves and at the stems themselves, they end up, hence the name club mosses, in little structures that support sporangia, almost like cones, as a matter of fact. But instead of producing seed, they will produce sporangia. The water ferns, there are a number of water ferns like Marsilea, the water clovers, a lot of floating plants, even to this day in freshwater ponds, are in the fern allies group. This is the water ferns that look like clover. They have a four-leafed frond. The mosquito ferns, azolas, very common also in fresh water. they have a compound frond, like the frond of common land ferns. And the most important one, Salvinia, the water spangles, very invasive, as a matter of fact, in some of our water bodies, reservoirs, and rivers. They all belong in the ferns. For some reason, the ferns are common in wet environments because they need, uh, they don't produce, remember, they don't produce pollen, they produce sperm that floats in water and swims in order to fertilize the ovule. So in places that are permanently wet, ferns have a reproductive advantage. And this is like an evolutionary memory of where they come from. They have still a very similar reproductive system to that of algae, in which the male gamete swims in the water to find the female gamete. And then perhaps I think this is, yeah, this is the last one, the equisetums, known as horsetails. These you have in campus, are planted in many parts in campus. They are planted outside Head House 3, where we normally have our classes. Here you can see they look like ferns, but their sporangia are not in the underside of leaves, but they form like little cones, like a specialized structure that supports sporangia. And you can see here the evolutionary connection between ferns and gymnosperms. They already have reproductive organs organized in cone-like structures and little strobiles, but they're not actually producing seed as in the gymnosperms. They are producing spores, and they have the typical alternation of generations that is typical of the ferns and defines the life cycle of the ferns. So this is basically all. Ferns, of course, are on themselves. Imagine if they lived for 100 or 200 million years on Earth, the level of diversification and complexity the taxon has, and its evolutionary history, the complexity it has. I don't want to spend, or I can't spend in one class, even attempt to discuss and explain the richness of life and life forms of the fern family. I just want you to be informed in this class, which is oriented mostly at wildflowers, on the existence of ferns, their evolutionary history, their presence in the past on Earth, and their presence to this day in many of our California ecosystems as extremely important plants. So this is it. This is the last lecture of BPSC 031, Spring Wildflowers. And in the next two classes, we are going to do a review of the course and prepare the students for a final exam, for which I won't wish you luck, because that means you're not good and you need luck to pass it. I think by what I've seen of the class that everybody is very good and everybody will pass the class because you have studied. But I wish you that we all do well on this final exam. Thank you very, very much for your attendance to this course.